Weather. We're glad that you're here. We are going to get into the book of Proverbs today, and we think for the first part of this study, we will, in large measure, kind of work our way through the chapters. We won't be covering everything, but these first 9 chapters do have a kind of order to them and some flow to them. So today we're in the first chapter, verses 1 through 7, and remember that when we get into the book of Proverbs, the overarching theme of everything we'll talk about in this book is wisdom. Wisdom is sometimes seen as a way of navigating life. It is sometimes seen as a divine gift. It is sometimes seen as the practice of prudence, of smart or faithful decision making. But it colors everything there is in this book. Sometimes it's talked about as an actual entity, and other times it's talked about as that which guides us. And so what we have in these first 7 verses is prologue, and the first thing we read is the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel, and then we get the explanation of why. So, Verse 2 following, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill, to understand a proverb, and to figure the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. A good introduction here, because we get a far-ranging description of what wisdom does. We get words like justice, righteousness, equity, shrewdness, prudence. All of these. Wisdom is such a massive word in the book of Proverbs that we will see over and over again that we can attribute many different things to it that are always connected with it. And Michael, that I think that makes wisdom both a very interesting concept, but a tricky one in that as we're going to see it used in this book, it's gigantic. It's enormous.
Yeah, Clint, I think that's true. I think it's difficult. I think we might come to this concept of wisdom with our own kind of preconceptions about what that means. And I think already we're beginning to see some of the assumptions about wisdom worked out right here in verse 2. The idea of learning about wisdom and instruction. I think sometimes we think that wisdom is something that can only be sort of earned through age. That's only a thing that can come through that school of hard knocks. But I think, Clint, that actually wisdom as it's conceived of in the Proverbs is something that we can actually grow into. It's something that can be taught, that those who are significant in our lives can actually pass on to us things that we couldn't do without it. So I think that it's significant that we begin this study of Proverbs with this recognition that wherever you are in your own journey of life, you might feel like you're farther down that road or not. But regardless, we can all learn something about wisdom. And I'm not sure that that's something that we necessarily assume coming to a book like Proverbs.
Yeah, and fundamentally, when we talk about wisdom, we talk about the ability to navigate life well. And on the flip side of wisdom, we see it here, is the fool. The fool is the one who wants to insert themselves into conversations. The fool is the one who doesn't take instruction. The fool is the one who doesn't understand righteousness, justice, equity. And therefore, the fool is, in the language of Proverbs, ungodly, because wisdom always ties us to God's will. We see it here in verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's not the end, it's where we start. And fools despise wisdom because the fool lives their life apart from God's guidance. The fool lives their life unwilling to follow those guidances, those things that God sets before us. And so this is perhaps the biggest difference in the way that we use the word and the way in which the Bible uses the word wisdom. We could talk about wisdom in a general sense, a non-spiritual sense. The Bible cannot. The book of Proverbs cannot talk about wisdom without connecting it to faithfulness in God. And therefore, wisdom is always working for righteousness, for justice, for truth. Because to be wise in the book of Proverbs is to be faithful. It is to be able to implement into practice those things which God calls us to do. And so this word, the fear of the Lord, in Hebrew, that word fear is awe, it's reverence. It's not a fear as in afraid, although there's an aspect of that, but it's much bigger than that. And that's the place where wisdom starts, to put ourselves in proper relationship with God. And once we do that, we are ready to seek wisdom. And we're not ready to seek wisdom until we do that. And I think, Michael, that is a fundamentally different way of understanding wisdom than the way that we often use it culturally.
Yeah, I would keep going down that road a little bit here, Clint. I'm looking at verse 3. I think these three words are really critical here: righteousness, justice, and equity. And we may not attribute those words to the idea of knowledge, but I think here in the biblical concept, in the Proverbs concept of wisdom, these things are by definition relational, Clint. Justice and equity. This has to do with other people. And I think that when we think of this distinction, this fine line between what we know and what is biblical wisdom, knowledge can be something that's sort of retained, that it's self-beneficial. Maybe it's even, in a sense, sort of a self-help. Knowledge can be something that only has to do with you. Wisdom, I don't think, can ever just stop with you. Wisdom is always about informing your relationships with others. And so this book is best read in community. It's best read as a fellowship, because you're never going to be able to live a life of wisdom that doesn't involve practicing the things that you know. So it doesn't deny knowledge. Certainly you are going to learn, memorize. You're going to be able to repeat sort of these wise sayings that we have throughout this book. But it's not just about repeating those or regurgitating those statements, those wise sayings. This book is literally about transforming the way that we live with one another in community. Because if it does that in our community, the writer of Proverbs is going to say we're going to live a better, more righteous, more just, more equitable. Help me out here. Equitable. There it is. Life.
Yeah, and so ultimately, wisdom, and in fact, we'll see this, wisdom is proved by, and often the word, the feminine is to hear, wisdom is proved by her actions. So again, I think the great benefit to the biblical concept of wisdom is this connection between what we know and what we do. And biblically speaking, to know something but not act upon it is foolishness. That is not wisdom. That is not the practice of godliness, and it is something else. And so we said this yesterday, but wisdom and foolishness are the two poles between which Proverbs navigates. And so when we gravitate toward doing the right thing, we are being wise. There is a much more application element. There's a great deal of application in the concept of wisdom that is not necessarily inherent in the concept of knowledge. And so wisdom is always that which acts for good. And in this case, biblically speaking, good always has to do with godliness. And there is an interesting thing you'll notice as we go through this book. You'll see it in verse 7 here. You will see that when Lord is written, that's written with all capital letters. And you may know this, but when you see that in the Old Testament, it means that is an instance where the name, the divine name Yahweh, has been used. You will see other places where it's capital L and then small case O-R-D, and that's another word in Hebrew. But whenever you see Lord in all caps, that is the divine name Yahweh. And if I remember right, all but 3 instances in the book of Proverbs are the use of Yahweh. So there's no sense that this is generic. This is a very specific document that comes out of Israel's faith and Israel's history. To use Yahweh as the divine name in this book is to equate wisdom with being faithful, not to some concept of spirituality or some God in general, but very intently with the God of the Old Testament, the God of the covenant. And we see in that this spiritual component that wisdom will embody really throughout the book.
Yeah, and this has something to say, Clint, about how we conceive of acquiring wisdom and that becoming a part of who we are as people. It's critical here in verse 7. What's the beginning of knowledge? It's the fear of the Lord. And there's an orientation that is completely a forerunner to the understanding of how we acquire wisdom. In other words, humility and the willingness to listen, the understanding that we have something to learn, the awfulness, the amazing grandeur of who God is supposed to impart not a kind of terrified fear. That's not what Scripture means by the idea of the fear of the Lord, but rather a willingness to recognize the vast difference between God as creator and we as creature, and that we are substantially benefited by being able to humbly submit to the direction and the guidance of the Lord. So wisdom, I think, to tie some threads together, is by definition active. It's by definition communal. It's by definition always humbling ourselves so that we might have something to learn from God. And if we're able to start the book with that posture, we're already practicing the kind of wise learning that we are being called to here in the first few verses.
Yeah, I think humility is the right word. You know, there is a legend written of Socrates where he was once asked, "Are you the wisest man here down in the teaching center?" And he said, "If that is true, it is only true because I know how much I do not know." And that's the sense of wisdom, to start with the idea that I have much to learn. And as I have a quote written on my chalkboard in my office, it is impossible to learn what you think you already know. And so wisdom is by definition humble. It is by definition open. Wisdom is never going to assume that it has all the answers, or it wouldn't be wisdom. That doesn't mean that wisdom doesn't embrace truth. It absolutely does, and you'll see that 1,000 times in our study. But wisdom always seeks to acquire more wisdom, because wisdom is the thing in this book that navigates a well-lived life. It takes wisdom to live well, and therefore we are always to be on the lookout to add wisdom to our lives in order to do better and better. So there's no end to wisdom. It's never finished. It's an ongoing journey. And I think that, again, we see here the fear of the Lord is what? The beginning. It's not the end. It's
right.
It's not the place that we arrive ultimately. It's not our wisdom that gets us to revere the Lord. It's revering the Lord that puts us on the path of wisdom to start with. And that is this is a great verse. And if there is a memory, you'll probably find some Proverbs that you'll want to remember. I would commend to you 1:7 as a good place to start.
Well, yeah, we're glad that you have joined us today. We hope that you are inspired to continue with us on this journey through the Proverbs. Lots of good stuff here, only scratching the surface, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Yeah, we clearly live in a world of wisdom and foolishness, and we'll try to navigate through it.
It'll be something to take away. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. This is a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.